Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit on Scientific Cognition. Continuing with the preface. As regards historical truths, to mention these briefly, it will be readily granted that so far as their purely historical aspect is considered, they are concerned with a particular existence, with the contingent and arbitrary aspects of a given content, which have no necessity. But even such plain truths as those just illustrated are not without the movement of self-consciousness. To cognize one of them, a good deal of comparison is called for. Books must be consulted. In some way or other, inquiry has to be made. Even an immediate intuition is held to have genuine value only when it is cognized as a fact along with its reasons, although it is probably only the bare result that we are supposed to be concerned about. As for mathematical truths, we should be even less inclined to regard anyone as a geometer who knew Euclid's theorems outwardly, by rote, without knowing their proofs, without, as you might say, to point the contrast, knowing them inwardly. Similarly, if someone became aware, through measuring a number of right-angled triangles, that their sides do, in fact, have the well-known relation to one another, we should consider his mere awareness of the fact unsatisfactory. Yet even in mathematical cognition, the essentiality of the proof does not have the significance and nature of being a moment of the result itself. When the latter is reached, the demonstration is over and has disappeared. It is, of course, as a result that the theorem is something seen to be true, but this added circumstance has no bearing on its content, but only on its relation to the knowing subject. The movement of mathematical proof does not belong to the object, but rather is an activity external to the matter in hand. Thus the nature of the right-angled triangle does not divide itself into parts, in just the way set forth in the construction necessary for the proof of the proposition that expresses its ratio. The way and the means by which the result is brought forth belong entirely to the cognitive process. In philosophical cognition, too, the way in which the outer existence, qua existence of a thing, comes about is distinct from the way in which its essence or inner nature comes to be. But, to begin with, philosophical cognition includes both existence and essence, whereas mathematical cognition sets forth only the genesis of the existence, that is, the being of the nature of the thing in cognition as such. What is more, philosophical cognition also unites these two distinct processes. The inner coming to be of genus or genesis of substance is an unbroken transition into outer existence, into being for another, and conversely, the genesis of existence is how existence is by itself taken back into essence. The movement is the twofold process and the genesis of the whole, in such wise that each side simultaneously posits the other, and each therefore has both perspectives within itself. Together they thus constitute the whole, by dissolving themselves and by making themselves into its moments. In mathematical cognition, insight is an activity external to the thing. It follows that the true thing is altered by it. The means employed, construction and proof, no doubt contain true propositions, but it must nonetheless be said that the content is false. In the above example, the triangle is dismembered and its parts consigned to other figures, whose origin is allowed by the construction upon the triangle. Only at the end is the triangle we are actually dealing with reinstated. During the procedure it was lost to view, appearing only in fragments belonging to other figures. Here, then, we see the negativity of the content coming in as well. This could just as much have been called a falsity of the content as is the disappearance of supposedly fixed conceptions in the movement of the notion. But what is really defective in this kind of cognition concerns the cognitive process itself as well as its material. As regards the former, we do not, in the first place, see any necessity in the construction. Such necessity does not arise from the notion of the theorem. It is rather imposed, and the instruction to draw precisely these lines, when infinitely many others could have been drawn, must be blindly obeyed, without our knowing anything beyond except that we believe that this will be to the purpose in carrying out the proof. In retrospect, this expediency also becomes efficient, but it is only an external expediency because it becomes evident only after the proof. This proof, in addition, follows a path that begins somewhere or other, without indicating as yet what relation such a beginning will have to the result that will emerge. In its progress, it takes up these particular determinations and relations, and lets others alone. Without its being immediately clear what the controlling necessity is, an external purpose governs this procedure. The evident character of this defective cognition, of which mathematics is proud, and on which it plumes itself before philosophy, rests solely on the poverty of its purpose and the defectiveness of its stuff, and is therefore of a kind that philosophy must spurn. Its purpose or notion is magnitude, it is just this relationship that is unessential, lacking the notion. Accordingly, this process of knowing proceeds on the surface, does not touch the thing itself, its essence or notion, and therefore fails to comprehend it, that is, in terms of its notion. The material regarding which mathematics provides such a gratifying treasury of truth is space and the numerical unit. Space is the existence in which the notion inscribes its difference as in an empty lifeless element in which they are just as inert and lifeless. The actual is not something spatial, as it is regarded in mathematics, with non-actual things like the objects of mathematics. Neither concrete sense intuition nor philosophy has the least concern. In a non-actual element like this, there was only a truth of this same sort, that is, rigid dead propositions. We can stop at any one of them, the next one starts afresh on its own account, without the first having moved itself onto the next, and without any necessity connection arising through the nature of the thing itself. Further, because of this principle and element, and herein consists the formalism of mathematical evidence, this kind of knowing moves forward along the line of equality. For what is lifeless, since it does not move of itself, does not get as far as the distinction of essence, as far as essential opposition or inequality, and therefore does not make the transition of one opposite into its opposite, does not attain to qualitative immanent notion of itself, motion of itself. Movement, self-movement. For it is only magnitude, the unessential distinction, that mathematics deals with. It abstracts from the fact that it is the notion which divides space into its dimensions and determines the connections between and within them. It does not, for example, consider the relationship of line to surface, and when it compares the diameter of a circle with its circumference, it runs up against their incommensurability. That is a relationship of the notion, something infinite and eludes mathematical determination. Nor does the immanent, so-called pure mathematics, set time, qua time, over against space, as the second material for its consideration. Applied mathematics does indeed deal with time, as well as with motion and other concrete things, but the synthetic propositions, i.e. propositions regarding relationships determined by their notion, it takes from experience and applies its formulas only on those presuppositions. The fact that the so-called proofs of propositions, such as those regarding the equilibrium of the lever, or the relation of space and time in the motion of falling, etc., are often given and accepted as proofs itself only proves how great is the need of proof for cognition, seeing that where nothing better is to be had, cognition values even the hollow semblance of it and obtains from it some measure of satisfaction. A critique of these proofs would be as noteworthy as it would be instructive, partly in order to strip mathematics of these fine feathers, partly in order to point out its limitations, and thus show the necessity for a different kind of knowledge. As for time, which is to be presumed, would constitute, as the counterpart of space, the material of the other part of pure mathematics, it is the existent notion itself. The principle of magnitude, of difference not determined by the notion, and the principle of equality, of abstract lifeless unity, cannot cope with that sheer unrest of life and its absolute distinction. It is therefore only in a parallelized form, that is to say, as the numerical unit, that is, the negativity becomes the second material of mathematical cognition, which, as an external activity, reduces what is self-moving to mere material, so as to possess in it an indifferent external lifeless content. Philosophy, on the other hand, has to do with not with unessential determinations, but with the determinations insofar as it is essential, its element and content is not the abstract or non-actual, but the actual, that which posits itself and is alive within itself. Existence within its own notion. It is the process which begets and traverses its own movements, and this whole movement constitutes what is positive in it, and its truth. This truth therefore includes the negative also, what would be called the false, if it could be regarded as something from which one might abstract. The evanescent itself must on the contrary be regarded as essential, not as something fixed, cut off from the true, and left lying who knows where, outside it, any more than the true is to be regarded as something on the other side, positive and dead. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, that is, subsists intrinsically, and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. The true is thus the bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk, yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. Judged in the court of this movement, the single shapes of spirit do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do, but they are as much positive and necessary moments as they are negative and evanescent. In the whole of the movement, seen as a state of repose, what distinguishes itself therein and gives itself particular existence is preserved as something that recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as immediately existence. Mathematical Objects by Man Ray. It might seem necessary at the outset to say more about the method of this movement, that is of science, but its notion is already to be found in what has been said, and its proper exposition belongs to logic, or rather it is logic, for the method is nothing but the structure set forth in its pure essentiality. We should realize, however, that the system of ideas concerning philosophical method is yet another set of current beliefs that belongs to a bygone culture. If this comment sounds boastful or revolutionary, and I am far from adopting such a tone, it should be noted that current opinion itself has already come to view the scientific regime bequeathed by mathematics as quite old-fashioned, with its explanations, divisions, axioms, sets of theorems, its proofs, principles, deductions, and conclusions from them. Even if its unfitness is not clearly understood, little or no use is any longer made of it, and though not actually condemned outright, no one likes it very much, and we should be sufficiently prejudiced in favour of what is excellent to suppose that it will be put to use and will find acceptance. But it is not difficult to see that the way of asserting a proposition, adducing reasons for it, and in the same way refuting its opposite by reasons, is not the form in which truth can appear. Truth is its own self-movement, whereas the method just described is the mode of cognition that remains external to its material. Hence, it is peculiar to mathematics, and must be left to that science, which, as we have noted, has for its principle the relationship of magnitude, a relationship alien to the notion, and for its material dead space and the equally lifeless numerical unit. This method too, in its looser form, i.e. more blended with the arbitrary and the accidental, may retain its place as in conversation or in a piece of historical instruction, designed rather to satisfy curiosity than to produce knowledge, which is about what a preface amounts to. In ordinary life, consciousness has for its content items of information, experiences, concrete objects of sense, thoughts, basic principles. Anything will do as a content, as long as it is ready to hand, or is accepted as a fixed and stable being or essence. Sometimes consciousness follows where this leads, sometimes it breaks the chain and deals arbitrarily with its content, behaving as if it were determining and manipulating it from outside. It refers the contact back to some certainty or other, even if only to the sensation of the moment, and conviction is satisfied when a familiar resting place is reached. But we have already pointed out that once the necessity of the notion has banished the slipshod style of conversational discussion, and along with it the pedantry and pomposity of science, they are not to be replaced by the non-method of presentiment and inspiration, or by the arbitrariness of prophetic utterance, both of which despise not only scientific pomposity, but scientific procedure of all kinds. Of course, the triadic form must not be regarded as scientific when it is reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow, and when scientific organization is degraded into a table of terms. Kant rediscovered this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it was still lifeless and uncomprehended. Since then it has, however, been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form in its true content has been presented, so that the notion of science has emerged. This formalism, of which we have already spoken generally, and whose style we wish here to describe in more detail, imagines that it has comprehended and expressed the nature and life of a form, which it has endowed it with some determination of the schema as a predicate. The predicate may be subjectivity or objectivity of, say, magnetism, electricity, etc., contraction or expansion, east or west, and the like. Such predicates can be multiplied to infinity, since in this way each determination or form can again be used as a form or moment in the case of another, and each can gratefully perform the same service for another. In this sort of circle of reciprocity, one never learns what the thing itself is, nor what the one or the other is. In such a procedure, sometimes determinations of sense are picked up from everyday intuition, and they are supposed, of course, to mean something different from what they say. Sometimes what is in itself meaningful, for example, pure determinations of thought like subject, object, substance, cause, universality, etc. These are used just as thoughtlessly and uncritically as we use them in everyday life, or as we use ideas like strength and weakness, expansion and contraction. The metaphysics is in the former case as unscientific as are our sensuous representations in the latter. Instead of the inner life and self-movement of its existence, this kind of simple determinateness of intuition, which means here sense knowledge, is predicated in accordance with the superficial analogy, and this external empty application of the formula is called a construction. This formalism is just like any other. What a dullard a man must be who could not be taught in a quarter of an hour the theory that there are asthenic, and indirectly asthenic diseases, and as many modes of treatment. And since still more quite recently such instruction sufficed, who could not hope to be transformed in a short space of time from an empirical into a theoretical physician? The formalism is such a philosophy of nature. Teachers say that the understanding is electricity, or the animal is nitrogen, or that they are equivalent of the South and North Pole, etc., or represented. Whether all this is expressed as boldly as here, or even concocted with more terminology and confronted with such a power which brings together things that appear to lie far apart, and with the violence suffered by the passive things of sense through such associations, and which imparts to them the notion's semblance, but serves itself the trouble of doing the main thing, namely, expressing the notion itself or the meaning of the sensuous representation. Confronted with all this, the untutored mind may be filled with admiration and astonishment, and may venerate in it the profound work of genius. It may be delighted too with the clarity of such characterizations, since they replace the abstract notion with something that can be intuitively apprehended, and so made more pleasing, and it may congratulate itself on feeling a kinship of soul with such a splendid performance. The knack of this kind of wisdom is as quickly learned as it's easy to practice. Once familiar, the repetition of it becomes as insufferable as the repetition of a conjuring trick already seen through. The instrument of this monotonous formalism is no more difficult to handle than a painter's palette, having only two colours, say red and green, the one for colouring the surface when a historical scene is wanted, the other for landscapes. It would be hard to decide which is greater in all this, the casual ease with which everything in heaven and earth and under the earth is coated with this broth of colour, or the conceit regarding the excellence of this universal recipe. Each supports the other. What results from this method of labelling all that is in heaven and earth with the few determinations of the general schema, and pigeonholing everything in this way, is nothing less than a report clear as noonday on the universe as an organism, namely a synoptic table like a skeleton with the scraps of paper stuck all over it, or like the rows of closed and labelled boxes in a grocer's stall. It is as easy to read off as either of these, and just as all the flesh and blood has been stripped from this skeleton, and the no longer living essence has been packed away in the boxes, so in the report, the living essence of the matter has been stripped away or boxed up dead. We have already marked that this way of thinking at the same time culminates in a style of painting that is absolutely monochromatic. For it is ashamed of its schematic distinctions, these products of reflection, and submerges them all in the void of the absolute, from which pure identity, formless whiteness, is produced. This monochromatic character of the schema and its lifeless determinations, this absolute identity and the transition from one to the other, are all equally products of the lifeless understanding and external cognition. The excellent, however, not only cannot escape the fate of being thus deprived of life and spirit, of being flayed and then seeing its skin wrapped around in a lifeless knowledge and its conceit, rather we recognise even in this fate the power that the excellent exercises over the hearts, if not over the minds, of men. Also the constructive unfolding into universality and determinateness of form in which its perfection consists, and which alone makes it possible for the universality to be used in a superficial way. Science dare only organise itself by the life of the notion itself, the determinateness, which is taken from the schema and externally attached to an existent thing. Is in science the self-moving soul of the realised content. The movement of a being that immediately is consists partly in becoming another than itself, and thus becoming its own immanent content, partly in taking back into itself this unfolding of its content, of this existence, of it, that is, in making itself into a moment, and simplifying itself into something determinate. In the former movement, negativity is the differentiating and positing of existence. In this return into self, it is the becoming of the determinate simplicity. It is in this way that the content shows that its determinateness is not received from something else, nor externally attached to it, but that it determines itself and ranges itself as a moment, having its own place in the whole. The understanding, in its pigeonholing process, keeps the necessity and notion of the content to itself, all that constitutes the concreteness, the actuality, the living movement of the reality which it arranges, or rather it does not keep this to itself, since it does not recognise it. For if it had this insight, it would surely give some sign of it. It does not even recognise the need for it, else it would drop its schematizing, or at least realise that it can never hope to learn more in this fashion than one can learn from a table of contents. A table of contents is all that it offers, the content itself does not offer at all. Even when the specific determinateness, say one like magnetism for example, is in itself concrete or real, the understanding degrades it into something lifeless, merely predicating it of another existent thing, rather than cognizing it as the immanent life of the thing, or cognizing its native and unique way of generating and expressing itself in that thing. The formal understanding leaves it to others to add this principal feature. Instead of entering into the immanent content of the thing, it is forever surveying the whole and standing above the particular existence of which it is speaking. That is, it does not see it at all. Scientific cognition, on the contrary, demands surrender to the life of the object, of what amounts to the same thing, confronting and expressing its inner necessity. Thus absorbed in its object, scientific cognition forgets about that general survey, which is merely the reflection of the cognitive process away from its content and back into itself. Yet, immersed in the material and advancing with its movement, scientific cognition does come back into itself, but not before its filling or content is taken back into itself, is simplified into determinateness, and has reduced itself to one aspect of its own existence and passed over into its higher truth. Through this process, the simple self-surveying whole itself emerges from the wealth in which its reflections seem to be lost. In general, because, as we put it above, substance is in itself or implicitly subject, all content is its own reflection into itself. The subsistence of substance of anything that exists is its self-identity, for a failure of self-identity would be its dissolution. Self-identity, however, is pure abstraction, but this is thinking. When I say quality, I am saying simple determinateness. It's by quality that one existence is distinguished from another, or is an existence. It is for itself, or it subsists through this simple oneness with itself, but it is thereby essentially a thought. Comprehended in this is the fact that liking is thought, and this is the source of the insight which usually eludes the usual superficial talk about the identity of thought and being. Now, since the subsistence of an existing thing is the self-identity of pure abstraction, it is the abstraction of itself from itself, or it is itself, its lack of self-identity, and its dissolution, its own inwardness, and withdrawal into itself, its own becoming, because this is the nature of what is, and insofar as what is has this nature for our knowing, this knowing is not an activity that deals with the content as something alien, is not a reflection into itself, away from the content. Science is not that idealism which replaced the dogmatism of assertion with the dogmatism of assurance, or a dogmatism of self-certainty. On the contrary, since our knowing sees the content return into its own inwardness, its activity is totally absorbed in the content, for it is the immanent self of the content, yet it has at the same time returned into itself, for it is pure self-identity, in otherness. Thus it is the cunning which, while seeming to abstain from activity, looks on and watches how determinateness with its concrete life, just where it finds it is pursuing its own self-preservation and particular interest, is in fact doing the very opposite, is an activity that results in its own dissolution and makes itself a moment of the whole. Above we indicated the significance of the understanding in reference to the self-consciousness of substance. We can now see clearly from what has been said its significance in reference to the determination of substance as being. Existence is quality, self-identical determinateness, or determinate simplicity, determinate thought. This is the understanding of existence, that is the nature of existence from the standpoint of the understanding. Hence it is nous, I think it's pronounced nous, as Anaxagoras first recognized the essence of things to be. Those who came after him grasped the nature of existence, more definitely as eidos or idea, determinate universality, species or kind. It might seem as if the term species or kind is too commonplace, too inadequate, for ideas such as the beautiful, the holy, and the eternal that are currently in fashion. But as a matter of fact, idea expresses neither more nor less than species of kind. But nowadays, an expression which actually designates a notion is often spurned in favour of one which, if only because it is of foreign extraction, shrouds the notion in a fog, and hence sounds more edifying. Precisely because existence is defined as species, it is a simple thought. Nous, simplicity, is substance. On account of its simplicity, or self-identity, it appears fixed and enduring. But this self-identity is no less negativity, therefore its fixed existence passes over into its dissolution. The determinateness seems at first to be due entirely to the fact that it is related to another, and its movement seems imposed on it by an alien power, but having its otherness within itself and being self-moving is just what is involved in the simplicity of thinking itself. For this simple thinking is the self-moving and self-differentiating thought. It is its own inwardness. It is the pure notion. The common understanding, too, is a becoming, and as this becoming, it is a reasonableness. It is in this nature of what to be in its being, its own notion, that logical necessity in general consists. This alone is the rational element and the rhythm of the organic whole. It is much knowledge of the content as the content is the notion or essence. In other words, it alone is speculative philosophy. The self-moving concrete shapes make itself into a simple determinateness. In so doing, it raises itself to logical form and exists in its essentiality. Its concrete existence is just this movement and is directly a logical existence. It is for this reason unnecessary to clothe the content in an external logical formalism. The content is in its very nature the transition into such a formalism, but a formalism which ceases to be external since the form is the innate development of the concrete content itself. The nature of scientific method, which consists partly in not being separate from the content, and partly in spontaneously determining the rhythm of its movement, has, as already remarked, its proper exposition in speculative philosophy. Of course, what has been said here does express the notion, but cannot count for more than an anticipatory assurance. Its truth does not lie in this partly narrative exposition, and is therefore just as little refuted by asserting the contrary, by calling to mind and recounting conventional ideas as if they were established as familiar truths, or by dishing up something new with the assurance that it comes from the shrine of inner divine intuition. A reception of this kind is usually the first reaction on the part of knowing to something unfamiliar. It resists it in order to save its own freedom and its own insight, its own authority from the alien authority, for this is the guise in which what is newly encountered first appears, and to get rid of the appearance that something has been learned and of the sort of shame that this is supposed to involve. Similarly, when this unfamiliar is greeted with applause, the reaction is of the same kind and consists in what, in another sphere, would take the form of ultra-revolutionary speech and action. What therefore is important in the study of science is that one should take on oneself the strenuous effort of the notion. This requires attention to the notion as such, to the simple determinations, for example, of being in itself, being for itself, self-identity itself, for these are pure self-movements such as could be called souls, if the notion did not designate them something higher than soul. The habit of picture thinking, when it is interrupted by the notion, finds it just as irksome as does formalistic thinking that argues back and forth in thoughts that have no actuality. That habit should be called material thinking, a contingent consciousness that is absorbed only in material stuff, and therefore finds it hard work to lift the thinking self clear of such matter, and to be with itself alone. At the opposite extreme, argumentation is freedom from all content and a sense of vanity towards it. What is looked for here is the strenuous effort required to think in terms of notion, to give up this freedom and instead of being the arbitrarily moving principle of the content, to sink this freedom in the content, letting it move spontaneously of its own nature by the self as its own self, and then to contemplate this movement. The refusal to intrude into the immanent rhythm of the notion, either arbitrarily or with wisdom obtained from elsewhere, constitutes a restraint which is itself an essential moment of the notion. There are two aspects of the procedure of argumentation to which speculative thinking is opposed and which call for further notice. First, such reasoning adopts a negative attitude towards the content it apprehends. It knows how to refute it and destroy it. That something is not the case is a merely negative insight, a dead end which does not lead to a new content beyond itself. In order to have a content once again, something new must be taken over from elsewhere. Argumentation is reflection into the empty I, the vanity of its own knowing. This vanity, however, expresses not only the vanity of this content, but also the futility of this insight itself, for this insight is the negative that fails to be the positive within itself. Because the reflection does not get its very negativity as its content, it is never at the heart of the matter, but always beyond it. For this reason, it imagines that by establishing the void, it is always ahead of any insight rich in content. On the other hand, in speculative thinking, as we have already shown, the negative belongs to the content itself and is the positive, both as the immanent movement and determination of the content and as the whole of this process. Looked at as a result, what emerges from this process is the determinate negative, which is consequently a positive content as well. But in view of the fact that such thinking has a content, whether of picture thoughts or abstract thoughts or a mixture of both, argumentation has another side which makes comprehension difficult for it. The remarkable nature of this other side is closely linked with the above-mentioned essence of the idea. or rather it expresses the idea in the way that it appears as the movement which is thinking apprehension. For whereas in its negative behaviour, which we have just discussed, ratiocinative thinking is itself the self into which the content returns, in its positive cognition, on the other hand, the self is the subject to which the content is related as accident and predicate. The subject constitutes the basis to which the content is attached and upon which the movement runs back and forth. Speculative thinking behaves in a different way. Since the notion is the object's own self, which presents itself as the coming to be of the object, it is not a passive subject, inertly supporting the accidents. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving notion, which takes its determinations back into itself. In this movement, the passive subject itself perishes, it enters into differences and the content and constitutes the determinateness, i.e., the differentiated content and its movement, instead of remaining inertly over against it. The solid ground which argumentation has in the passive subject is therefore shaken, and only this movement itself becomes the object. The subject that fills its content ceases to go beyond it and cannot have any further predicates or accidental properties. Conversely, the dispersion of the content is thereby bound together under the self. It is not the universals which, free from the subject, could belong to several others. Thus the content is in fact no longer a predicate of the subject, but is the substance, the essence and the notion of what is under discussion. Picture thinking, whose nature is to run through the accidents or predicates, and which, because they are nothing more than the predicates and accidents, rightly goes beyond them, is checked in its progress, since that which has the form of a predicate is a proposition is the substance itself. It suffers, as you might put it, a counter-thrust. Starting from the subject, as though this were a permanent ground, it finds that since the predicate is really the substance has passed over into the predicate, and by this very fact has been sublated, and since in this way what seems to be the predicate has become the whole and the independent mass, thinking cannot roam at will, but is impeded by this weight. Usually, the subject is first made the basis as the objective, fixed self. Thence the necessary movement to the multiplicity of determinations or predicates proceeds. Here the subject is replaced by the knowing I itself, which links the predicates with the subject holding them. But since the first subject enters into the determinations themselves and is their soul, the second subject, viz. The knowing I, still finds in the predicate what it thought it had finished with and got away from, and from which it hoped to return into itself, and instead of being able to function as the determining agent in the movement of predication, arguing back and forth whether to attach this or that predicate, it is really still occupied with the self of the content, having to remain associated with it instead of being for itself.